It's our guy, Rich Cimini, the longest tenured New York Jets beat reporter of all time. Rich, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Jake. And by the way, great. I like how you updated your opening there. You got the Fernando thing in there. You got the Ty Simpson clip from the Combine. Awesome stuff.
I appreciate that. I also, while I was there, was not expecting to be, covering Aaron Glenn saying he had superpowers and the debate on whether or not he was dozing off. What did you make of the just last week for the New York Jets down in Indy?
Well, the Jets are always making news no matter what. The superpower quote. Now, I wasn't at the Combine, as we talked about a little earlier. I was a victim of that snowstorm. I got plenty of cancellations and couldn't get out. But yeah, I was watching. I was taken aback a little by the superpower quote. He's confident. Okay, so we'll say that. That's a very interesting quote. I have a feeling we have not seen or heard the end of that quote. And the falling asleep thing. Look, people say he wasn't. That he was looking down at his tablet. I don't know. I think it got blown out of proportion because it's the Jets, because it's social media. And, coaches, they don't even need to watch the 40-yard dash. I mean, that's half the coaches in the league don't even go to the Combine. So I think that was much to do about nothing.
Totally agree with you there. In terms of Glenn's presser last week, you had some great reporting on your end on what happened with the Wink Martindale situation. Based on Glenn's answers, what did you think of that, knowing what you reported on previously?
Well, there's two different, it's like the he said, talking to people in Wink's camp. He said he would have never made that trip to New Jersey for that second interview if it was under the pretext that, he wasn't going to call the plays, whereas Glenn made it very clear that Wink was on board with a scenario where he would not be calling the plays. So it's hard to believe, what situation were there. Something changed in the interim there. I reported that, they had that big powwow down in Palm Beach at Woody Johnson's home, which is not unusual. They do that every year. It's the organizational meetings. And I think it was there that it was decided that Glenn would call the plays. Glenn said it was my decision. I heard from sources around Glenn that it was his decision. People in the Wink camp, say that, Woody Johnson told him to do it. I tend to believe the people in the Glenn camp there, I think Wink's camp probably has a little bit of an axe to grind, that he didn't get that job. So a very curious situation. But in the end, I think it turned out okay because I think Glenn, I don't know about superpower, play caller, but he did a good job in Detroit, especially that last year. So I think they ended up in a good spot.
I thought it was interesting that Dan Campbell last week, when talking at the Combine, he referenced the fact that Jim O'Neill, who interviewed for the Jet DC job, had an opportunity to go for the Jets. So, of course, Brian Duker got the DC job, and Glenn's going to be the play caller. But do you know anything else on that? Was Jim O'Neill the preference? And then when something didn't happen there, they then made the pivot and then hired Brian Duker?
Yeah, you noticed that as well from Campbell. I do think O'Neill was probably the preference there. And why wouldn't he be? I mean, he's more experienced. He's got defensive coordinator experience. He was with Glenn in Detroit, as was Duker. But O'Neill, I think, was probably higher in the pecking order. And he turned that into a raise and a bigger title in Detroit. So good for him. And then Glenn quickly pivoted to Duker. And, Duker's going to be, quote unquote, the defensive coordinator. But we all know, Superman is going to be running the defense.
We have a question for Rich Cimini throughout our show here. Write it in. Super Chats will cut the line. Rich is kind enough to give us some time. And everyone check out Rich's podcast, Flight Deck, which is available wherever you get your Jets podcast. Rich, in terms of the move the Jets made already last week, it won't become official till the new league year. But what was your take on the Jermaine Johnson for Tavondre Sweat deal?
Yeah, I thought it was a good trade for both teams. I was not surprised. I mean, they almost traded Jermaine during the season last year. He was a guy with 1 year left on his deal. They clearly were not going to extend him this year. They probably weren't going to give him a new deal next year unless he just had a total, monster year. So I think solidifies what we all thought. They're going to go to a 3-4 defense. You don't acquire a 360+ pound nose tackle, if you're not going to be playing a 3-4. So they get a starting nose tackle, which I thought was good because this is a weak draft for defensive tackles. It's a weak free agency for defensive tackles. So they get a starting caliber player on a very team-friendly deal for 2 more years. And Saleh gets his wide 9 pass rusher in Jermaine Johnson. He had success under Saleh. It's a good scheme fit for Jermaine. And so I thought it was a good trade. I mean, there is some risk on both sides, with the Jets. I mean, Sweat has had some weight issues. I kind of, conjuring up some memories of Mekhi Becton's situation. This guy has been 390, close to 400 pounds in his career. So when he's in shape, he's a pretty good run stuffer, and he brings you a little bit in the pass rush as well. So I like the trade. It saved the Jets more than $11 million on the cap, which they turn around and they use on Breece Hall to tag him. So I like the trade.
In terms of what it now means for the rest of the defense, it feels like, to your point, they're going 3-4. How does that impact now the top of the draft? Would you say it's more likely than not one of the edge rushers is the pick at 2?
Yeah, I thought they were going to take edge before that trade. Now I think they have to. And they're lucky because the next 2 best players in the draft after Mendoza are Arvell Reese and David Bailey. So I think they'll take one of those guys, slide them right in as an outside linebacker. It's a good scheme fit for those guys. Reese, of course, can do different things. He can play off-ball linebacker as well. So he brings that dimension. And I think Will McDonald will be the other outside linebacker, which is probably a better position for him. He was overpowered in the running game, as a down lineman. Now you've got great depth on your nose, with your one technique is Sweat. Harrison Phillips was the one technique last year. You got a great rotation there. You got Jawan Briggs, who was mostly the 3 technique last year, but can play that. Maybe they can slide him out and play a little 5. What you need now is a couple of defensive ends, some bigger 280, 290 pound defensive ends, who can do a 2 gap in a 3-4. So I think that's what you're looking for in the draft and free agency.
In terms of other trades, right? Of course, the Jermaine Johnson deal happens and immediately people start speculating, well, who else could be moved? Have you heard anything in regards to any players currently on this team that you could see being dealt?
Well, the Jets don't have a lot of tradable commodities. I mean, sure. I mean, they'd love to trade Justin Fields. I don't think that's going to happen. They're going to cut him at some point. And once they get their quarterbacks figured out, they'll probably at that point cut Justin. Who else? I mean, Jamie and Sherwood is a guy who
Salah won him.
That's interesting. Who's the middle linebacker from Tennessee? I'm not even sure, but Salah's a guy who that's the contract's the issue there. He's got some money. I think he's making 8 or 9 or 10 somewhere, this year, guaranteed base salary. But that's another interesting. He fits Salah's scheme. Salah discovered him basically, and made him what he was. So if they're willing to take on the money, maybe there's another deal there. Maybe there's a Jamie and Sherwood for Will Levis deal in the offing here coming up. Other than that, I mean, could they make a minor trade, some holdovers from the previous regime, possibly. But I think Sherwood would be the one guy you would say, he's not a real great scheme fit anymore. He didn't have a great year last year. And I think they could, move on for him if they can find someone to take the money.
You mentioned Breece Hall. Let's get into that because that broke, of course, yesterday. The Jets officially using the non-exclusive franchise tag on Breece. What were your thoughts on that move, and how far away are they from potentially actually getting a long-term deal done before that July 15th deadline now?
A little surprised they went with the franchise because everything I had been hearing would be transition. I think what Darren Mougey realized, from being at the Combine for a week was that this running back market was going to be a little more robust than maybe he thought. You got guys like Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs who are eligible for extensions. They are going to get, top of the market type deals. Maybe not top. Saquon is there, but pretty close to that. You got Kenneth Walker III, who's going to be a free agent, who's going to get a really good deal. So I think the Jets probably decided, let's just take out any risk and give him the extra $3 million, and we'll go with the franchise tag. So I think I don't think anybody objectively could say that Breece Hall is a top 5 running back. Honestly, I don't even think he's a top 10 running back. But I think Mougey, anticipating the market, factored heavily into that. So I give him props for that. And if I'm Breece, I'm not signing anything now. I want to wait until those guys sign their deals. Then my floor is going to go higher. So if I'm Breece Hall, I'm just going to chill out for a while. I don't think he'll probably won't show up for the offseason, the voluntary stuff. And he's not obligated to, if he doesn't sign that tender. So I don't think we'll see Breece Hall for a while. And if I'm him, I might just chill out till July 15th before I think about signing a long-term deal.
So he sent out this tweet yesterday saying, always been the type to bet on myself, been working, see y'all soon, love. That, like, to me, just reading that feels like, okay, he's going to bet on himself. He maybe doesn't want to sign any deal, and because he thinks the Jets maybe aren't offering what he's worth. Could you see him ultimately, even if the Jets offer him different variations of a contract, just saying, you know what, I'm going to bet on myself. I'll go out there and have a great year, and I'll be a free agent next year?
Yeah, Breece Hall, the king of the cryptic tweet. He's done
Always.
this quite often all year. Free 20. Remember that one? Hashtag free 20. This is just typical Breece posturing. I mean, you read this tweet, it's basically saying, I'm going to play on the tender. It's saying, I'm going to play on the 1 year and I'm going to bet on myself. There's obviously some posturing that goes into that. I don't think he was a happy camper towards the end of the year. This losing, I don't think sits well with him, nor should it with any player. I mean, his record is, what is he, like 22 and 40 something since he's been with the Jets? It's a horrific winning percentage. I think he'd love to go out and get a new deal. He's probably frustrated by this tag because he can't go anywhere now. But that's the business, that's the business that the Jets are doing. It's good business for the Jets to tag him. So I'm sure he's pretty frustrated, but that's posturing. I think if the Jets made him the right offer, I think he would suddenly forget all about that other stuff and sign it.
Is a tag and trade in the cards at all, or do you fully expect if they can't get a deal done, the Jets truly want him on the team for this year?
Someone texted me the other day and just said, watch, they'll trade him. It's ordinarily I would say no, they'll keep him, but let's look at the past history of this regime. I mean, they signed Sauce Gardner to a monster deal in July and they trade him in November. So I don't think you could rule anything out. If I think something like that you'd want to do before the draft if you were to trade him. Do I think the Jets want to trade him? No, I do not believe the Jets want to trade him. The type of offense they want to run is going to be running through the running game. Let's face it. It's not going to be a quarterback-driven offense because they're not going to have a good quarterback this year. So it's going to be run through Breece Hall. And so I do not believe the Jets want to trade him. I think the only way it would get to that point if Breece Hall just pulls a Jamal Adams, and just, goes crazy and makes a lot of noise and says, I want out. So, but like I said, never say never with the Jets.
I'm glad you brought Jamal Adams up because I was going to reference that. Joe Douglas says at the combine that year, we want him to be a Jet for life. And then by that summer, he's trashing Adam Gase in the newspaper and he's getting traded, days after that.
Yeah. You always have to, these GMs carefully, I want him to be a Jet for life. Yeah. It's what you want. That's not what he wants. And so, I actually caught up to Jamal about a month ago. We had a nice conversation and, did a little reminiscing about that. He just felt, look, he got paid, he got hurt, in Seattle, but he got paid. He got his deal that he was looking for. And so GM, I think you might have asked him, Mougey, the question, right, at the combine about, do you think Breece Hall wants to be here?
Right, because he came out and said right away, we're going to use the tag, but there's been all this rumblings, is Breece unhappy? So I go, do you get the sense from talking to him he actually wants to stay a Jet? That was my question.
Yeah, he said, I do get the sense that he wants to be here. And I kind of agree with that because they have been negotiating. There have been talks. So if he really wanted out, there would be no talks. I mean, his agent would just say, no, we're not going to do this. But there have been talks. So he's got a good agent. I know Nicole Lynn, and I think she's above board, pretty straightforward. So it sounds like he wants to be here for the right contract.
Rich Cimini's our guest. If you guys have a question, write it in. We'll get to some of those coming up. All right. We've waited long enough. Let's talk about the quarterback situation. I was reading your story over the weekend where you talked about how the Jets are likely looking at potentially 2 names. And then, of course, they could add someone in the draft. As things stand right now, and we know that Kyler Murray is the latest QB that's going to be released and he's going to be available. What do you anticipate the Jets' plan being at the quarterback spot?
That's very interesting. He's going to be released next week. next Wednesday, right? I mean, that's when he'll officially be released. So it's a very interesting quarterback market. I don't know if we've ever seen a quarterback market like this, because you have a bunch of guys who are going to be released who are making a ton of guaranteed money from their previous team. So you're going to see him and Tua and Kirk Cousins get contracts for the veteran minimum this year for 1.3, and their old team will be on the hook for the rest of it. So they'll be making decisions based really more on football and not as much money driven. So that adds a different dimension to it. I am not a huge Kyler Murray fan. However, I do think the Jets will have interest, because who else is out there? He might be the best of a bad lot. And there's leadership questions with him. There's durability questions. However, he's only 28 years old. He started a lot of games in the NFL. He's had some success more towards the beginning of his career. Really hasn't been the same since he left the Kingsbury offense. Now he's got the foot injury. Is he healthy? That's another question you have to consider. I do think the Jets will have interest in Kyler Murray. I'd be a little surprised if they got him, because I think he might want to go to a place like Minnesota, where Kevin O'Connell has a better track record of developing young quarterbacks. So I think that would probably be more appealing. I think Murray's a name to watch. I think Jacoby Brissett is a name to watch. That would be by trade. Frank Reich loves him. Backstory on him: Bill Parcells loves Jacoby Brissett. He considers him like a son. He's known him since high school. It's like they're very, very close. And of course, he's going to give a glowing recommendation to Aaron Glenn on Jacoby Brissett. So he's a name to watch. I think Jarrett Stidham is a name to watch. I mentioned him in my notes column on Sunday. You have the Mougey connection, the Robbie Payton connection there as well. He's a name to watch if Sean Payton wants to part with him. I think those would be the top three. I have my list right. Malik Willis is the big name. I'd be a little surprised if the Jets get involved in that. That's just going to be a lot of money. And it's going to be like the Justin Fields contract. So I'm not sure they want to go down that road again. A really interesting name for me, and I don't know if the Jets will have interest, but Spencer Rattler is a guy who I think you could get for a late round pick, who obviously got replaced, in New Orleans, but I think he's got some upside. So I would keep an eye on him. But I think those are probably the main guys. Andy Dalton, of course, because of the Frank Reich connection. But, man, I think he's on his last legs. They're looking to replace him as the backup in Carolina. So what does that tell you? So it's fascinating. Murray's the big name. I think Murray and Tua are probably the two best quarterbacks who will be out there. I don't think Aaron Glenn is the biggest Tua fan. But, look, this much I can guarantee you. No matter who they get, and I think it'll be two guys, I don't think Jet fans are going to be happy, and nor should they be, because this is not a great year to be looking for a quarterback. So no matter who they get, it's going to be go to a used car lot. You're buying a used car with a lot of dings and dents and chips in the paint, because that's what's out there right now. That's what I think they'll do, and then I think they'll wait till 27 to make their big splash in the draft.
I'm fascinated if they're truly interested in Kyler, because everything we've heard about Frank Reich is his preference is the taller, bigger, stronger QB, and Kyler Murray is the total opposite of that. Everything we've heard about Aaron Glenn is it's all about the team and accountability, and the leadership matters at that position. And Kyler has some questions there, certainly in his career. It just would feel like an odd fit. And I wonder, is it just sheer desperation if they were to make that move, or do they actually think, Kyler, just because he's so cheap, it would cost them nothing? That's the only reason why they'd bring him in.
You just hit on the two key words, Jake: sheer desperation. I was talking to one of his former teammates about a month ago, and he's like, the Jets do not want to get into the Kyler Murray business just because of the leadership questions. There's been some questions about his work ethic. You're right. Everything you said is right. But who else is out there? I mean, what it goes against, it runs counter to what Aaron Glenn is trying to build.
Do you think they'd let him compete for the job, or they just hand him the starting job? Because that was my issue a year ago with Fields. It's like you're just handing him the job when Glenn's preaching competition all over the place on the roster. He made Joe Tippmann have to win a job with Josh Myers, for crying out loud. To me, if you just hand Murray the job, make him earn it. Like what Baker Mayfield had to do when he was in Tampa, had to beat out Kyle Trask to get that job.
Well, that's another interesting component to this. the other interesting component is, yeah, you don't have to pay him this year, except for the minimum. But like, what's the second year of the contract going to look like? And to me, that is really key, because are the Jets going to really backload like a 2-year deal with money in the second year, when maybe they want to draft a first-round quarterback in 27, where if I'm Kyler Murray, maybe I can get a lot more in the second year from Minnesota or a team like that. So it's a very complex, I have to write a quarterback story coming up in these next couple of days. I think I'm going to have to mention like 15 guys in the story, which I hate doing, but there's just really it's just a weird market, because all these GMs who need quarterbacks are waiting for guys to get cut. They're not going to trade for any of these guys like Tua or Kyler. So you're waiting for guys to get cut. And then you got the whole contract situation, which is different. It's a fascinating quarterback market. I don't even know who would I bet on right now. Like, who would you bet on? Like, ending up with, I guess if I had to bet, like maybe a Jacoby Brissett, I wouldn't be totally blown away if they got Kyler Murray. I think that's a possibility. But it's up in the air, man. It's really up in the air.
What I struggle with, Rich, is I have a tough time just picturing the Jets, making a trade for Spencer Rattler and Davis Mills, or and I heard from my Houston context, he's going nowhere. But like, let's say it's not Davis Mills, it's Tanner McKee, who seems to be like a trendy name. Fans have mentioned the Eagles backup quarterback, and like that's the whole room. And then maybe they draft someone at some point. Like, don't they need someone with some sort of resume? If you're Aaron Glenn, you're on the hot seat. Like, to me, I feel like they end up with either a Brissett, or they get Derek Carr out of retirement, or even Kyler, just because I think they need someone at that position that at least you could try and sell yourself on, maybe if they're protected, could actually be a competent player for you this year.
Yeah, that's why I think they'll get two. So they'll probably bring in a younger type guy, and then maybe more of an older type guy, just to balance it out a little bit. And then quite possibly draft a guy as well. So, the Jets, it's such a fascinating, because really, if you look at it, it's fascinating. The best thing for the Jets this year is probably to lose this year, get as high a pick as possible, and draft one of those guys next year. But the coach can't do that. The coach is going to be gone. He can't sell 3 or 4 wins to his owner for another year. And so, it could be a wipeout clean slate next year, with a new regime. I think they'll keep Mougey, but so the coach has to win. So he's got to get a quarterback who can get him 6, 7, 8 wins this year. But for the best long-term health of the organization, it's probably best almost to scrap the year and build for the 27 draft.
You said something interesting there, and I wondered this. You said, hey, they'll probably keep Mougey. Do you think Darren Mougey has done enough where he's almost separated himself a little bit from the head coach? Because I remember when Mougey was hired, press conference with Glenn, Woody Johnson referred to Darren as Glenn's sidekick. And I think if you talk to any Jet fan and just objectively analyze the last year, Mougey has done far more better things at his job than certainly the head coach of the Jets has through their first seasons together.
Yeah, I would agree with that. He's not the sidekick anymore. I do think Glenn has he still carries the most weight in the organization, but I do think if this were to be another disastrous type year, assuming they drafted well this year, if they have another solid draft, then I think Mougey would be more of a long-term guy for the Jets, and a lot of that is just the nature of those jobs. The GM usually has more job security than the coach. The coach is usually the fall guy when something goes bad. And, certainly Aaron Glenn has put himself on the line this year because there's no one else to get rid of. He got rid of his offensive coordinator. He got rid of his defensive coordinator. He's doing the defense. And so there's no one else to kick off the ship. He'll be the next one to go overboard. So, yes, Mougey is no longer the sidekick. And I think he's done a sneaky good job with what he's done so far. And, kudos to him on that.
Yeah, you talk to anyone around the league, it's like, I don't know about the coach, but people have really good things to say about Darren Mougey. So I just think it's notable that, the owner referred to him as a sidekick a year ago, and here we are a year later. And there's a lot of people who think Mougey could be here if Glenn's not.
Yeah, my long-term, if things go, and I don't want to see Aaron Glenn fail. It's like, I'm not wishing him ill will. I mean, it's a better story I'm a journalist. I don't really care who wins or loses. Our job, we root for the best story. And the best story, I mean, if the Jets turned it around this year under Aaron Glenn, that would be an awesome story. Coming back from what he did last year to make them a good team, that would be an incredible story journalistically. But if things do go south again, I could see them hiring like a Davis Webb next year. Just Mougey knows him from Denver. He is going to be the hot coaching assistant next year, an offensive guy, a quarterback guy. The Jets will be drafting a quarterback. Makes a ton of sense. So, but like I said, let's see what happens. Glenn is certainly confident in his ability. I think Jet fans are like, all right, we've heard enough from the coach's mouth. Let's see some results.
Super chats cut the line. We got 2 quarterback themed questions. Bino, we just talked all about some of the options. And then Gator with a super chat. He says, is Mac Jones an option? What would the cost be, assuming San Fran would consider trading him?
Yeah, I don't think San Francisco. I think it would be like a 2nd round pick. It's going to be a lot because, Brock Purdy's had some injury issues. I don't think Mac Jones, I don't think they're eager to move him. I think they'd have to be blown away by an offer. And when you give up a 2nd round pick for a guy, that's more than just a 1-year bridge situation. So I'd be a little surprised. I mean, I think Mac Jones would be good for the Jets. I think he'd fit nicely into what Frank Reich is trying to do. I think he went through the quarterback rehab with Shanahan last year, which we know has worked for some, including Sam Darnold. So I think that would be a good addition, but not for a 2nd round pick. I don't think that jives with what the Jets are trying to do long term.
What the biggest issue the Jets might have? It feels like not having a 3rd round this year because of the infamous Hassan Reddick deal. That's potentially hurting them because any of these guys we could talk about, if it takes a 3rd to get it done, you'd love to be able to do it, but you don't have it. And I don't think any Jet fan wants to trade any of the 2 2nd rounders for Mac Jones.
No. I mean, they could probably come up with a 3rd if he did some, maneuvering. So, yeah, I'm sure Mougey could come up with something creative to get a 3rd round pick, but it is the infamous Hassan Reddick trade. Gosh, he's a free agent again now. Who knows where he'll end up?
Comments, questions, super chats. We'll cut the line. Appreciate this question here from Dominic, who writes in. Question for Rich. How does he think Glenn is handling all the criticism and mockery thrown his way? Do you think it affects him, or is he pretty Teflon?
That's a really interesting question. He knows what's said about him. No, I don't think he's on Twitter like Saleh and checking out what we're tweeting. I don't think he's into it to that extent, but I think he's certainly aware of the perception of him and the perception of the team. And I don't think he was happy with the way the team was portrayed last year. I think he felt that the media could have been a little bit more understanding in terms of what the team was trying to accomplish long term in terms of the rebuilding and being a little bit more patient. So I don't think he agreed with the coverage from that sense. I'm sure his phone blew up with the so-called sleeping at the combine viral moment. I'm sure he didn't appreciate that, but I think he has thicker skin than some other Jet coaches I've covered for sure.
What would he be upset about with the coverage? He came in and puffed his chest out. He took shots at Saleh's staff repeatedly all summer during training camp. He said at the combine, we're here to win now and going forward. When you guys have always asked him for specifics on things that have improved, he either talks around it or makes a mockery of the role of head coach when he references 0 kicks being blocked as one of the positives from a 3-win season. They started 0-7. Like, again, I want Aaron Glenn to work out because I'm a Jet fan, Rich. But when I hear that he's upset with the coverage of how his first year went, what did he expect? He then fired 9 of 21 assistants and both coordinators.
You're preaching to the choir, Jake. I agree with you. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to be look, I think, how should we frame? It's hard to be positive when you're 0-7, right? I mean, right. It's like no matter what the expectations weren't high last year, but they weren't 3-14 type of expectations. I think the Vegas number was 5.5, right? I think I picked them to go 7-10 last year, so my expectations were a little higher. I thought I thought there was talent on the team at the beginning of the year. There's no way they should have been 0-7, you know? And so I think he did a poor job. I think Aaron Glenn, and maybe he will admit this now, I think he's got to do a better job with his messaging. You know, you're right. He came out guns blazing. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. We're not the same old Jets, blah, blah, blah. And you're 0-7, and it looks terrible. You know, it's a bad optic when you're talking that way and you're performing down here. So I think his messaging has to be better. I think he made some rookie mistakes in terms of messaging and the way he was trying to get his team perceived. So, you know, maybe it's a learning experience. Maybe this year it'll be different. I hope so.
Well, then he says, you know, play calling is his superpower. So now, you know, anytime, you know, the defense struggles or if he doesn't perform, that's going to be referenced. I mean, do you get a sense just from the aftermath of even those comments that he realizes like that statement now is gonna follow him throughout the year if they don't turn this defense around?
I don't think that one bothers him. You know, I think because he's got a lot of confidence. I mean, you talk to any player who played with him or coached with him, and it's like you don't last that long in the NFL as a 5'9" cornerback unless you got a chip on your shoulder and you have just an endless supply of confidence. And he did, and he does. So I don't think that superpower quote bothers him. I almost think he gets off on that. I really do. It puts pressure on him for sure, but I think he's so confident in his ability that he doesn't mind that pressure. He did a good job. I mean, the early years in Detroit were terrible. I mean, he almost got fired. You know, Campbell, you know, to his credit, he stuck it out with Glenn, and it worked out in the end. The last 2 years were much better, especially that last year. So I think he did a good job play calling. But you know what, Jake? No matter who the play caller is, you got to have the horses on defense or offense. And right now, the Jets are sorely lacking for playmakers on defense.
In terms of like what the Jets need to do for him to get another season, Rich, it's such a weird spot because as you brought up earlier, you could definitely argue the best thing for them would be to lose and benefit from having all these picks next year in a way better QB class. But the head coach, to your point, can't afford another 3 or 4 win season. So how do the Jets balance like the long-term future, all these picks that Mougey potentially has? And then also, of course, well, they need to show a lot more improvement in the short term to even get the opportunity to be here for 2027.
Yeah, it's a fascinating dynamic because you just captured it very, very succinctly and very accurately. And I'm not saying this is going to happen, but you could have some conflicting agendas. And we've seen this, you know, I've covered the Jets a long time, and I've seen this over and over again. You get to a point where maybe the GM is thinking more long-term, whereas more the head coach is like, hey, dude, I got to win now. You got to get me X, Y, and Z for players. And I'm not saying that's going to happen with these guys, but there is kind of maybe a different agenda. Mougey's thinking, I got those 3 number ones next year. And Glenn is like, I need a quarterback this year. So I'm not predicting that things are going to go awry like it did with Rex Ryan and John Idzik or McCagnon and Gase or whatever. You know, I'm not saying they're going to go there. I think they're just going to have to navigate a very tricky situation right now because Glenn has to show progress. I'm not going to say he's got to win 6 or 7 games. Woody Johnson just wants to see progress. And if they can't show progress after what they put on the field last year, then something is terribly wrong because last year was arguably the worst Jet season ever. And it was probably in the worst 3 Jet teams they ever fielded in their history, which is saying something. And so just be better on defense, show some creativity on offense, be more competitive in games. They did cut down on penalties last year, so we'll give them that. You know, they ran the ball a little bit better. Just don't be embarrassed every week. Be competitive, you know. And so, I think they probably, you know, if they can't win 6 or 7 games, something's wrong.